Just look around you right now. Nearly 70% of adults in developed nations are overweight or obese. Depression and anxiety rates have tripled in the last 2 decades. Type 2 diabetes is appearing in children. Sleep disorders have become so common that entire industries exist just to help us fall asleep. And despite billions being spent on health campaigns, gym memberships, diet books, and wellness apps, the stats keep getting worse. Now here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to ask. What if the problem isn't lack of willpower? What if the entire foundation of health advice we've built over the last 50 years was constructed on flawed assumptions, incomplete science, and oversimplified messages that were never designed to actually work in the real world? I'm Dr. Alex, I'm an emergency medicine doctor, and I've spent the last decade in some of the busiest emergency departments in the country, and I've seen the same pattern repeat thousands of times. Someone comes in with a preventable condition, chest pain, uncontrolled diabetes, severe anxiety, debilitating fatigue. And when you ask about their lifestyle, they tell you the same story. They've tried, they've followed the guidelines, they've eaten less, they exercised more, they counted calories, they joined the gym, they bought the meal prep containers, and it just didn't work. Or it worked briefly before everything collapsed back to baseline. The standard response is to assume that they lack discipline, but when you see this pattern in accountants, in teachers, business owners, students, retired athletes, people from every possible background, you start to realize something else is going on. People didn't fail the advice failed the people. So this isn't a video about conspiracy theories or rejecting science. It's about understanding how well-intentioned public health messages, designed to be simple enough for mass communication, stripped away so much biological nuance that they became functionally useless. So in the next hour, we're going to examine why calorie counting ignores the hormonal reality of metabolism, how the advice to eat less fat actually made us sicker, why BMI became medical law despite being invented by a mathematician in the 1830s, how we've ignored the catastrophic loss of muscle mass as we age, why mental health guidance treated the mind as separate from blood sugar and gut bacteria, and how the entire framework of willpower-based behavior change contradicts everything we know about neuroscience. We'll look at the biological laws of eating that never made it into the guidelines, meal timing, food sequencing, eating speed, and why inflammation, the driving force behind depression, brain fog, and metabolic disease, was barely mentioned in mainstream health advice. What you're about to hear challenges nearly everything you've ever been told about weight, about energy, about mental health, and longevity. Some of it might feel counterintuitive. Some of it will even make you feel angry that nobody explained this before. But all of it is grounded in physiology that medical schools barely teach and public health campaigns have never properly communicated. So let's start at the beginning, because understanding where health guidelines came from explains why they're so broken. So before the 1970s, most cultures had food traditions that evolved over centuries. People eat what their grandparents ate. They prepared food the way their communities had always prepared it. Nobody counted calories. Nobody worried about macronutrient ratios. Food was just food, seasonal, local, and prepared from recognizable ingredients. Obesity existed, but it was rare. Metabolic disease was an epidemic. And yes, heart disease was climbing, but the response to that problem would reshape everything that followed. In 1977, the United States government published the first dietary guidelines for Americans. The core message was revolutionary in its simplicity. Reduce fat intake, especially saturated fat, to prevent heart disease. Carbohydrates were positioned as safe, even beneficial. And the food pyramid was then born, with bread, cereal, rice, and pasta forming the foundation of what Americans should eat, 6 to 11 servings a day. Other developed nations then followed similar trajectories, and the scientific reasoning seemed sound at the time. Ansel Keys had published his famous 7-country study linking saturated fat to heart disease. Fat contains 9 calories per gram compared to 4 calories per gram for carbohydrates and protein. Reducing fat meant reducing calories, which seemed like an obvious path to preventing obesity and cardiovascular death. But then something strange happened. In the decades following these guidelines, obesity rates didn't decline. They absolutely exploded. In 1980, around 15% of American adults were obese. By the year 2000, that number had doubled. Type 2 diabetes, previously rare and primarily affecting older adults, began appearing in teenagers. Metabolic syndrome became so common, it required its own diagnostic category. The response from health authorities wasn't to question the guidelines, it was to assume people weren't following them properly. The message got louder, more emphatic: eat less fat, eat more whole grains, reduce calories, exercise more. Public health campaigns plastered these messages across schools, hospitals, and media. And the population got sicker. So what went wrong? Well, the shift from food culture to food science created a reductionist framework that treated the human body like a simple accounting system. Calories in, calories out. Fat makes you fat, carbohydrates are energy. Protein builds muscle. This approach ignored something fundamental. The body is not a calculator. It's a dynamic, adaptive organism that's regulated by hormones, influenced by circadian rhythms, shaped by gut bacteria, and responsive to hundreds of signals that have nothing to do with calorie counts. When you remove fat from food, you have to replace it with something. And that something was usually sugar or refined carbs. Low-fat yogurt became high-sugar yogurt. Low-fat cookies became high-carb cookies. The food industry responded to government guidelines by creating products that technically met the criteria, but metabolically performed worse than what they replaced. Real food, the stuff people had eaten for generations, was complex. It contained fiber, minerals, proteins, and fats in ratios that slowed digestion and stabilized blood sugar. When you ate an apple, for example, you got fructose bound with fiber and water, absorbed slowly over time. When you drank apple juice, marketed as healthy and low-fat, you got a glucose and fructose bomb that hit your bloodstream like refined sugar. No one explained this distinction. The guidelines focus on nutrients, not foods. And because people don't think in terms of macronutrient percentages when they're hungry at 3 a.m., the practical translation became: avoid butter, choose margarine. Avoid steak, choose pasta. Avoid whole milk, choose skimmed milk with added sugar. The shift also created a cultural anxiety around eating. Food stopped being something you enjoyed with family and became something you managed with guilt instead. Every meal turned into a moral test. Did you eat the right amount of fat? Did you count the calories? Are you being good today or bad today? This psychological burden, barely acknowledged in the official guidelines, would contribute to disordered eating patterns, to stress, and the exact metabolic dysfunction the guidelines were supposed to prevent. And looking back now, it's easy to see the mistakes, but at the time, the science seemed clear. The intentions were good, and the messaging was simple enough for mass adoption. That simplicity, though, was the problem. Biology doesn't fit on a poster. Metabolism doesn't follow slogans, and when public health guidance strips away complexity for the sake of communication, what you're left with isn't just incomplete, it's often directionally wrong. So the most common health advice given to anyone struggling with weight is breathtakingly simple. Eat less and move more. Create a calorie deficit. Burn more than you consume. It's just physics, right? Energy balance, thermodynamics, except the human body isn't a closed thermodynamic system. It's an adaptive biological organism that responds to energy restriction by slowing down, conserving resources, and increasing hunger signals. And none of that nuance made it into the guidelines. Calorie counting operates on an assumption that your metabolic rate stays constant, that if you normally burn 2,000 calories per day and you eat 1,500, you'll lose weight at a predictable rate until you reach your goal. But metabolic rate isn't fixed. It changes based on muscle mass, on hormone levels, stress, sleep quality, meal timing, previous dieting history, and even the temperature of the room you're sitting in. And I've seen this play out countless times in emergency departments and clinics. Someone comes in feeling exhausted, unable to lose weight despite eating salads all day and walking daily. Thyroid function tests are borderline, cortisol levels are elevated. They're sleeping poorly because they're hungry. Their body has downregulated metabolic rate to match the reduced calorie intake. They're cold all the time, their hair is thinning, their menstrual cycle has stopped or become irregular. And the advice they've been following, which is eat less, keeps making the situation worse. This isn't a failure of discipline, it's basic physiology. When the body perceives chronic energy restriction, it interprets that as a threat to survival. So leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, drops. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, then rises. Thyroid hormones decrease to conserve energy. The body becomes more efficient at extracting calories from food and storing them as fat. Muscle tissue, metabolically expensive to maintain, gets broken down for energy. The most damaging part of traditional weight loss advice is that it creates a metabolic adaptation that makes regaining weight almost inevitable. Study after study shows the same pattern. People lose weight through caloric restriction, they feel exhausted, irritable, and obsessed with food. And eventually, they can't sustain the deficit anymore. Not because they're weak, but because their biology is screaming at them to eat. When they return to normal eating, their suppressed metabolism means they gain the weight back faster than they lost it, often ending up heavier than when they started. This cycle of diet, restriction, metabolic slowdown, weight regain has been repeated literally millions of times across the globe. And the standard response is to blame the individual. They didn't stick with it. They lacked commitment. They chose the wrong diet. What almost never gets questioned is whether the approach itself is broken. People do not have a weight problem. They have a recovery problem, a hormone problem, a sleep problem, a stress problem, a muscle mass problem. Weight is the downstream consequence of all of these factors, not the upstream cause. Hormones, not calories, control where energy goes. Insulin determines whether glucose gets stored as fat or burned off as fuel. Cortisol influences fat distribution, pushing storage towards the abdomen. Testosterone and estrogen affect muscle maintenance. Growth hormones, released primarily during deep sleep, regulates tissue repair and fat metabolism. So if any of these are dysregulated, you can count calories perfectly and still struggle to lose weight, or even worse, lose muscle while retaining fat. Meal timing matters as much as meal content. Eating late at night when insulin sensitivity is naturally lower creates a different metabolic response than eating the same food earlier in the morning. Your body's circadian rhythm governs enzyme production, hormone release, and cellular repair. Eating against that rhythm disrupts metabolic health regardless of calorie totals. Sleep deprivation alone can derail weight loss efforts. One night of poor sleep increases ghrelin, decreases leptin, impairs glucose tolerance, and makes you crave high-calorie, high-carbohydrate food. Chronic sleep restriction creates a hormonal environment almost identical to insulin resistance, and yet standard weight loss advice rarely mentions sleep beyond a vague suggestion to get enough rest. And then there's muscle mass. Muscle is a metabolically active tissue that burns calories at rest and acts like a glucose sink, absorbing blood sugar and improving insulin sensitivity. As we age, we naturally lose muscle unless we actively work to preserve it. Most weight loss programs don't distinguish between losing fat and losing muscle. The scale goes down, so it's considered a success. But if you've lost 5 kilos and 3 of those were muscle, you've just made your metabolism slower and your long-term health much worse. Stress adds another layer. Chronic psychological stress elevates cortisol, which promotes fat storage, particularly visceral fat around the organs. It also impairs decision-making, reduces motivation, and increases cravings for comfort foods. Telling someone under chronic stress just to eat less ignores the biological cascade that stress creates. The traditional eat less, move more model also assumes infinite willpower, positioning weight loss as a battle between your rational mind and your impulses. But willpower is a finite resource that depletes throughout the day and is affected by blood sugar levels, stress, and cognitive load. Relying on willpower to override hunger signals, biological drives refined over millions of years of evolution, is setting people up to fail. The real issue isn't that calories don't matter. They do. But they matter within a context of muscle mass, of sleep, hormones, stress, meal timing, food quality, and metabolic health. Focusing exclusively on calorie balance while ignoring everything else is like trying to fix a car by only checking the fuel gauge. You've probably never been told that the order in which you eat your food can change your blood sugar response by up to 75%, or that eating slowly affects satiety hormones in ways that have nothing to do with calorie content, or that your body's ability to process carbohydrates drops significantly after sunset, regardless of how healthy you are. These aren't fringe theories. They are well-documented physiological mechanisms that somehow never made it into mainstream health advice. Glucose responses to meals don't just depend on what you eat, they depend on the sequence. Fiber first, protein second, starch last. This simple pattern can flatten the glucose spike from the exact same meal by half. Why? Well, because fiber slows gastric emptying and forms a physical mesh in the digestive tract that delays carbohydrate absorption. Protein stimulates incretin hormones that prime insulin response. By the time starches arrive, your body is already prepared to handle them efficiently. Eating vegetables before pasta creates a completely different metabolic outcome than eating pasta before veggies, even though the total nutrients are identical. One produces a sharp glucose spike followed by a crash that triggers hunger and cravings 2 hours later. The other produces a gentle rise and a gradual decline that keeps you satisfied for hours. This matters beyond blood sugar. Rapid glucose spikes trigger insulin surges, and insulin pushes glucose into cells. But when the spike is too sharp, insulin can overshoot, causing blood sugar to drop below baseline. And that post-meal crash, the 3 p.m. slump, the need for coffee an hour after breakfast, is often just poorly sequenced eating, creating a hormonal roller coaster. Meal timing operates on circadian principles most people don't know exist. Insulin sensitivity peaks in the morning and declines throughout the day. Eating a large carbohydrate-rich meal at 8 a.m. produces less fat storage and better glucose control than eating the identical meal at 8 p.m. Your pancreas, your liver, your muscle cells all follow internal clocks synchronized to light exposure and feeding patterns. Shift workers, like me, or people eating at irregular or random times, or anyone having their largest meal late at night are fighting against millions of years of evolutionary biology. The body expects food during daylight hours and rest during darkness. When you eat against that pattern, even if the food is healthy, you impair metabolic processing, disrupt your sleep quality, and increase inflammation. And the speed at which you eat changes everything as well. Eating quickly bypasses satiety signals that take about 20 minutes to register. Ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone, doesn't drop instantly when food enters your stomach. Leptin, the fullness hormone, doesn't rise immediately. If you finish your meal in 5 minutes, you've consumed potentially twice as much food as you needed before your brain even registered the satisfaction. Eating slowly also improves digestion. Chewing breaks down food mechanically and starts enzymatic breakdown in the mouth, with amylase in saliva beginning carbohydrate digestion. Thorough chewing reduces the workload on your stomach and intestines, improving nutrient absorption and reducing bloating and discomfort. There's also a parasympathetic nervous system component here. Eating in a relaxed state, what's called rest and digest mode, optimizes digestive enzyme secretion and gut motility. Eating while stressed, rushed, or distracted shifts the body into fight or flight mode, which suppresses digestive function. The same meal eaten while scrolling through emails produces worse metabolic outcomes than the same meal eaten calmly at the table with your family. Movement before meals, even just a 10-minute walk, improves glucose disposal. Muscle contraction opens glucose transporters in muscle cells independent of insulin. Pre-meal movement primes muscles to absorb glucose from the upcoming meal, reducing the burden on insulin and lowering post-meal blood sugar spikes. This is why post-meal walks are so effective. You're essentially clearing glucose at exactly the time it's entering the bloodstream. And then there's the gut microbiome. The bacteria in your digestive tract responds to meal timing and composition. Regular eating patterns support stable microbial populations. Erratic eating, skipping meals, late-night snacking, creates a microbial imbalance. Certain gut bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids that regulate metabolism, inflammation, and even your mood. The health of your microbiome depends on constant, predictable feeding rhythms. None of this is complicated. It doesn't require expensive supplements, or restrictive diets. But it does require understanding that eating isn't just about calories and macronutrients. It's about timing, sequence, speed, and context. Standard health advice told people what to eat, but it rarely mentioned how, when, or in what order. And that omission left out half the equation. You can eat the perfect foods in the wrong sequence at the wrong time too quickly while stressed and create metabolic chaos. Or you can eat relatively ordinary foods in the right pattern and optimize hormonal responses, energy stability, and long-term health. At the end of the day, biology has rules. They're not suggestions. If you've ever been to a doctor's appointment and you've been told that you're overweight based on your BMI, you've participated in one of the strangest quirks of modern medicine. The use of a 19th century statistical tool invented by a Belgian astronomer who wasn't a doctor to diagnose individual health. Body mass index was created in the 1830s by Adolphe Quetelet, however you pronounce it, who was a mathematician interested in defining the average man for population statistics. He developed a simple formula, weight in kilos divided by height in meters squared, to describe weight distribution across large groups of people. It was never intended to measure individual health. Quetelet himself had no medical training and no interest in physiology. For over a century, BMI sat relatively unused in medical practice. Then in the 70s and 80s, as obesity rates began climbing, health authorities needed a simple, cheap, universally applicable metric to track population trends. And BMI was perfect for that purpose. It required no special equipment, no blood tests, no imaging, just a scale and a measuring tape. But something shifted. A population-level statistical tool became an individual diagnostic criterion. Insurance companies adopted BMI thresholds to determine coverage. Governments used it to classify citizens as healthy or unhealthy. Doctors, including me, used it to recommend weight loss, and millions of people were told they had a health problem based on a formula that measures nothing about their actual physiology. BMI doesn't differentiate between muscle and fat. A professional rugby player with 10% body fat can have the same BMI as someone with 35% body fat and severe metabolic disease. Both get classified as obese. Muscle is denser than fat. Most people know that. It weighs more per unit volume. Anyone who lifts weight regularly, plays sports, or who has above average muscle mass will score higher on BMI despite being metabolically healthier than their sedentary counterparts. I've seen this absurdity firsthand. Athletes in peak condition being told they're overweight. Manual labourers with strong backs and legs classified as obese. Meanwhile, someone with a normal BMI but high visceral fat, the dangerous fat around the internal organs, gets a clean bill of health because the number falls within that acceptable range. BMI also ignores fat distribution, which matters far more than total fat mass. Visceral fat, stored around the liver, the pancreas, and the intestines, is metabolically active and inflammatory. It releases hormones and cytokines that impair insulin sensitivity and increases cardiovascular risk. Subcutaneous fat, stored under the skin, is relatively benign. Two people with identical BMIs can have wildly different visceral fat levels and therefore wildly different health outcomes. Waist to height ratio, a measurement almost nobody uses, is a far better predictor of metabolic health. If your waist circumference is more than half your height, you're at increased risk regardless of your total weight. This simple metric captures fat distribution in a way BMI never could, but because it's not as universally standardized, it hasn't replaced BMI in clinical practice. VO2 max, which is your maximal oxygen uptake during exercise, is one of the strongest predictors of longevity and cardiovascular health. It measures cardiorespiratory fitness, how efficiently your heart, your lungs, and your muscles work together. Someone with a high VO2 max and a high BMI is statistically far healthier than someone with a normal BMI and a low VO2 max. Yet standard health advice focuses obsessively on weight and barely mentions aerobic capacity. Muscle mass, bone density, hydration status, metabolic rate, None of these appear in BMI. The formula treats the human body like a two-dimensional object where height and weight are the only variables that matter. The real tragedy is how BMI has created psychological harm. People with healthy muscle mass, good metabolic markers, and strong fitness are told they are overweight. They internalize shame and anxiety over a number that doesn't reflect their biology. Others, skinny fat individuals with normal BMI but poor metabolic health, are reassured that they're fine when they may be pre-diabetic or sarcopenic. BMI thresholds also vary arbitrarily by population. Asian populations develop metabolic disease at lower BMI levels than European populations due to differences in body composition and fat distribution. Using universal cutoffs ignores genetic and ethnic variation. A BMI of 25 might be healthy for one population, but risky for another, yet the guidelines treat everybody identically. Health authorities know these limitations. Academic papers openly discuss BMI's flaws, yet it persists because it's simple, it's cheap, and it's established. Changing it would require rewriting the guidelines, retraining the clinicians, and admitting that decades of public health messaging were based on an incomplete metric. So instead, we have a system where professional athletes are labelled as obese. If I asked you to name the biggest health risk as you age, you'd probably say heart disease, cancer, or dementia. You probably wouldn't say losing muscle. And yet sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass and strength, is one of the most predictive factors for disability, for falls, for metabolic disease, and early death. After the age of 30, if you do nothing to prevent it, you lose 3 to 8% of your muscle mass per decade. And that accelerates after the age of 60. By 80, many people have lost 30 to 40% of their peak muscle mass, and almost nobody talks about it. Muscle isn't just for movement or for aesthetics. It's an endocrine organ that secretes hormones called myokines, which regulate metabolism, reduce inflammation, and support brain health. It's the largest glucose sink in the body, absorbing blood sugar and improving insulin sensitivity. Muscle mass directly correlates with metabolic health, with bone density, immune function, and cognitive performance. When you lose muscle, your resting metabolic rate drops. You burn fewer calories at rest, making weight gain easier and weight loss harder. Insulin resistance worsens because there's less tissue to absorb glucose. Bone density declines because muscle tension stimulates bone remodeling. Balance deteriorates because muscle supports joint stability. Falls are one of the leading causes of death in the elderly, not because falling itself is deadly, but because the cascade of immobility, hospitalization, pneumonia, and complications that follow a hip fracture often is. Muscle strength is the single best predictor of fall risk, yet public health campaigns focus on staying active without specifying that walking, whilst beneficial for cardiovascular health, does almost nothing to preserve muscle mass. The advice was always move more, walk 10,000 steps, take the stairs, park further away. All good for general activity, but functionally useless for preventing sarcopenia. Muscle responds to resistance, to progressive overload, to stress that forces adaptation. Walking doesn't provide enough stimulus. Neither does yoga, swimming, or cycling, unless done at intensities most people will never reach. Resistance training, lifting weights, bodyweight exercises, using resistance bands is the only reliable way to build and maintain muscle mass. It doesn't require a gym membership or expensive equipment. Push-ups, squats, lunges, pulling movements, these are sufficient if done progressively. But the message never penetrated public health guidance with the same urgency as eat less fat or walk more. I've seen these consequences in the emergency department that I work in, elderly patients who fall and can't get up. Not because they're frail in some vague sense, but because they lack the quad strength to stand from a seated position. People who can't carry groceries, climb stairs, or recover from illness because they don't have the muscle reserve to handle physical stress. Muscle mass also buffers against disease. So during illness, or an injury or surgery, the body breaks down muscle for amino acids to fuel immune response and tissue repair. If you start with a low muscle mass, you have less reserve. Recovery takes longer. Complications increase. Muscle is a biological insurance, and most people are underinsured. There's also a cognitive component to all of this. Resistance training improves brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which is a protein that supports neuron growth and cognitive function. Muscle contraction stimulates blood flow and metabolic signaling that crosses the blood-brain barrier. People who maintain muscle mass into old age have lower rates of dementia and cognitive decline. Nutritionally, muscle preservation requires adequate protein intake, especially as you age. Older adults need more protein per kilogram of body weight than younger adults because muscle protein synthesis becomes less efficient. Yet dietary guidelines focused on carbohydrate and fat ratios, with protein often treated as an afterthought. The standard recommendation was 0.8 grams of protein per kilo of body weight, a minimum to prevent deficiency, not an optimal amount for muscle maintenance. Athletes and older adults benefit from 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo, but that nuance rarely made it into public health messaging. And timing also matters. Muscle protein synthesis peaks when you consume 20 to 40 grams of protein in a single meal, spread evenly throughout the day. Eating 80 grams at dinner and minimal amounts at breakfast and lunch is less effective than distributing protein intake across 3 meals. Again, this wasn't part of the standard advice. Sarcopenia is preventable. You can build muscle at any age. Studies show that people in their 70s and 80s gain a significant strength and mass through resistance training. But they have to know it's possible and important. And for decades, the message was cardio, cardio, cardio. Heart health, calorie burn, step counts. Muscle was treated as optional, something for athletes and bodybuilders. The idea that everyone, regardless of age or fitness level, needs to actively preserve muscle mass never became a public health priority. Now we're seeing the consequences, which is an aging population losing strength, losing their independence, and metabolic health at rates that could have been mitigated with basic resistance training and adequate protein intake. Every failed diet, every abandoned exercise program, every broken New Year's resolution gets blamed on the same thing: lack of willpower. You just didn't want it enough. You weren't disciplined. You gave up too early. This narrative, deeply embedded in health advice and self-help culture, assumes that motivation is an infinite resource and that behavior change is purely a matter of wanting something badly enough. But that's not how the brain works. Willpower is a finite cognitive resource. Studies show that self-control depletes throughout the day. Every decision you make, every temptation you resist, every task you force yourself to complete drains the same mental energy pool. By the evening, when you're deciding whether to cook a healthy meal or order a takeaway, your willpower reserves are already exhausted. Glucose levels affect willpower too. Your brain runs on glucose, and when blood sugar drops, decision-making deteriorates, impulse control weakens, and the ability to delay gratification collapses. This is why people make worse food choices when they're already hungry, and why dieting, which often involves chronic low energy, paradoxically makes it harder to stick to healthy eating. Motivation follows a dopamine cycle that most health advice completely ignores. Dopamine doesn't just create pleasure, it drives anticipation and action. The brain releases dopamine when you expect a reward, not just when you receive it. This anticipation fuels behavior. But dopamine also needs contrast. If you're constantly stimulated, constantly chasing the next hit, dopamine receptors downregulate and motivation then collapses. This is why people can start a new diet or exercise program with intense enthusiasm and then burn out within weeks. The initial excitement, fueled by dopamine anticipation, fades when the behavior becomes routine. Without external rewards or novelty, motivation disappears. The advice to stay motivated assumes you can generate enthusiasm on demand, which is neurologically impossible. Rest is not laziness. Dopamine systems require recovery. After intense focus or effort, the brain needs downtime to restore baseline dopamine levels. If you skip recovery, cravings appear, not for food necessarily, but for anything that provides a quick dopamine hit, which could be sugar, social media, shopping, or even alcohol. And people interpret these cravings as personal weakness when they're actually symptoms of a neurological depletion. Health advice rarely addresses brain chemistry. It focuses on behavior. Eat this, don't eat that, exercise more, sleep better, without acknowledging that all behavior is downstream of neural activity. If your dopamine system is dysregulated, if your prefrontal cortex is exhausted, if your stress hormones are elevated, then no amount of willpower will overcome biology. Environment shapes behavior far more than motivation does. Willpower is what you use to resist temptation, but if you remove the temptation, you don't need willpower. Keeping junk food out of the house is exponentially more effective than trying to resist it every time you open the cupboard. Setting out workout clothes the night before removes decision-making friction in the morning. The brain follows the path of least resistance. If the healthy choice requires effort, planning, and willpower, and the unhealthy choice is immediate and easy, then biology favors the unhealthy choice. Relying on motivation to override that imbalance is exhausting and unsustainable. Habit formation operates on completely different neural pathways than willpower. Willpower is controlled by the prefrontal cortex, which is the rational, executive part of the brain. Habits run through the basal ganglia, which is an automatic, unconscious system. Once a behavior becomes habitual, it requires almost no willpower to maintain, but getting to that point requires repetition, consistency, and environmental cues, not motivation. Standard health advice treats every healthy behavior as if it needs to be consciously chosen every single time. Eat vegetables, go to the gym, drink water, meditate for a bit. Each one becomes a willpower tax. And compare that to someone who has built those habits around these behaviors. They don't decide to go to the gym, they just go. Same time, same day, no decision required. The action happens automatically. And sleep deprivation destroys your willpower. One night of poor sleep impairs prefrontal cortex function, the exact brain region responsible for self-control and decision-making. Chronic sleep restriction creates a state where you're trying to make healthy choices with a cognitively impaired brain, and yet health advice often treats sleep as secondary to diet and exercise. Stress has the same effect. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, which impairs executive function and increases impulsivity. Under stress, people default to immediate gratification because the brain prioritizes short-term survival over long-term planning. So telling someone under chronic stress to just make better choices ignores the neurobiological reality of what stress does during decision-making. Food cravings aren't moral failures, they're often signals of nutrient deficiency, blood sugar instability, or dopamine depletion. Craving sugar after a stressful day isn't weakness. It's your brain seeking quick glucose to restore energy and boost serotonin. Craving salty foods might indicate electrolyte imbalance. The advice to resist cravings treats symptoms without addressing the causes. But the most damaging part of the willpower myth is the shame it creates. People blame themselves for failing when the real failure is a system that demands superhuman self-control in an environment designed to undermine it. Ultra-processed foods engineered to bypass satiety signals, constant digital stimulation fragmenting attention, chronic sleep deprivation normalized as productivity. And when people can't maintain perfect discipline in this environment, they're told they lack character. Well, biology doesn't care about your intentions. It responds to structure, to environment, and constant input. Building systems that make healthy choices automatic is infinitely more effective than relying on daily motivation. But that message, boring and unsexy as it is, doesn't fit the narrative of willpower and personal responsibility. 8 hours of sleep. That's the standard advice for decades. And like most health guidance, it's technically correct but functionally incomplete. Sleep duration matters, obviously, but sleep quality, timing, architecture, and circadian alignment matter just as much, often more. You can spend 8 hours in bed and wake up exhausted if the sleep itself is fragmented, mistimed, or lacking in deep and REM phases. The body doesn't sleep uniformly. Sleep progresses through cycles, each about 90 minutes long, moving through light sleep, deep sleep, and REM sleep. Deep sleep, particularly in the first half of the night, is when the body performs physical repair, clears metabolic waste from the brain, and consolidates immune function. REM sleep, concentrated in the second half, processes emotions, integrates memories, and supports cognitive performance. If your sleep is mistimed, even 8 hours won't deliver the right balance. Going to bed at 2 a.m. and waking up at 10 a.m. technically gives you the right hours, but the circadian misalignment disrupts hormone secretion, particularly cortisol and melatonin. Cortisol should peak in the morning to wake you up and gradually decline throughout the day. Melatonin should rise in the evening to prepare you for sleep. When you sleep out of sync with natural light-dark cycles, these rhythms get scrambled. Temperature regulation is also critical and almost never discussed. Core body temperature needs to drop by about 1 to 2 degrees Celsius to initiate sleep. This is why hot environments make it harder to fall asleep and why a warm bath before bed can help. It causes vasodilation and heat dissipation afterwards. Now, most people sleep in rooms that are too warm. Optimal sleep temperature is around 16 to 19 degrees Celsius, which is far cooler than most thermostats are set. Late evening prevents deep sleep because digestion raises core body temperature and keeps the nervous system in a semi-alert state. Eating a large meal within 3 hours of sleep means that your body is still processing food when it should be entering restorative phases. Blood sugar fluctuations during the night can cause micro-awakenings that fragment sleep without you consciously realizing it. Blue light exposure from screens delays melatonin secretion by hours. Melanopsin, which is a photoreceptor in the eye, is particularly sensitive to blue light wavelengths. Even small amounts in the evening can shift circadian rhythms, pushing sleep onset later and reducing total sleep time. The advice was usually avoid screens before bed, but without explaining the mechanism, most people ignored it or didn't understand why it mattered. Tracking sleep creates its own problems too. Sleep apps and wearables give people detailed data, sleep stages, heart rate variability, disturbances per night. For some, this information is useful, but for others, it creates a lot of anxiety. Orthosomnia, which is obsessing over sleep metrics and becoming anxious about imperfect sleep, can paradoxically worsen sleep quality. The stress of trying to optimize sleep prevents the relaxation necessary for sleep to occur. Alcohol is a sleep disruptor masquerading as a sleep aid. It makes you drowsy and helps you fall asleep faster, but it fragments sleep architecture. Alcohol suppresses REM sleep, particularly in the first half of the night, and increases awakenings in the second half as the body metabolizes it. People wake up feeling unrested even after a full night because they didn't get restorative sleep stages. Caffeine's half-life is about 5 to 6 hours, meaning if you drink coffee at 3 p.m., a quarter of that caffeine is still in your system at midnight. For people who metabolize caffeine slowly, even morning coffee can affect nighttime sleep latency. Standard advice mentioned cutting caffeine, but didn't specify timing or even explain individual variation in metabolism. Stress affects sleep in ways that duration-focused advice ignores. Cortisol elevation keeps the brain in a hypervigilant state. Even when you're physically exhausted, if your cortisol hasn't dropped, sleep onset is delayed and sleep quality suffers. Cognitive behavioral strategies, breathwork, temperature manipulation, can lower cortisol more effectively than just trying to relax. Sleep debt accumulates and can't be fully repaid. One poor night of sleep increases hunger hormones, impairs glucose tolerance, and reduces cognitive performance. Chronic sleep restriction, even just an hour or two less per night, compounds over weeks and months, creating metabolic dysfunction, mood disturbances, and even immune suppression. Weekend catch-up sleep helps, but it doesn't fully reverse the damage. The light-dark cycle is the most powerful circadian regulator. Exposure to bright light in the morning, ideally sunlight, anchors your circadian rhythm and improves melatonin secretion. Darkness in the evening signals the brain to prepare for sleep. Modern life, with artificial lighting at all hours, disrupts this natural rhythm. The advice to get sunlight was mentioned occasionally, but never emphasized with the same urgency as diet or exercise. Sleep apnea, restless legs, insomnia, these are medical conditions, not lifestyle failures. Telling someone with obstructive sleep apnea to get more sleep is useless without treating the underlying airway obstruction. At the end of the day, millions of people have undiagnosed sleep disorders that sabotage their health, and standard advice did nothing to screen for or to address them. The 8-hour guideline doesn't account for individual variation. Some people genuinely need 9 or 10 hours, others function well on 6 or 7. Genetics plays a role in all of this. Age changes sleep needs and architecture. Judging yourself against an arbitrary number creates unnecessary stress. Sleep hygiene, which is the collection of behaviors that support good sleep, is more important than duration. Consistent sleep and wake times, a dark, cool room, minimal evening stimulation, no late meals, morning light exposure. These habits all create the conditions for quality sleep, which means it matters more than hitting a specific hour count. Public health advice reduce sleep to a duration target without addressing the biology that makes sleep restorative. And when people spend 8 hours in bed and still feel awful, they assumed something was wrong with them, not the advice. What if I told you that depression, brain fog, chronic fatigue, and stubborn weight gain could all trace back to the same underlying problem? And that this underlying problem barely gets mentioned in the standard health advice. I'm talking about chronic inflammation, one of the most important yet overlooked drivers of modern disease. Now, this isn't the inflammation you're probably thinking of. When you sprain your ankle or fight off an infection, you get acute inflammation. The redness, the swelling, and the heat, the signal that your immune system is doing its job. That's healthy, it's adaptive, and it's temporary. Chronic inflammation is something else entirely. It's systemic, it's low grade, and it's persistent, quietly damaging tissues for years before you notice anything's wrong. Now, here's how it works. Inflammation is controlled by signaling molecules called cytokines. When inflammation becomes chronic, pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, or CRP stay elevated long term. These molecules circulate through your bloodstream, cross into your brain, mess with your metabolic pathways, and disrupt neurotransmitter production. And the result is a cascade of symptoms that seem unrelated but are actually deeply connected. Take depression, for example. We've known for a while how depression can have inflammatory origins. Not all depression, obviously, but a significant subset of cases. When inflammatory markers are elevated, they impair the production and function of serotonin, of dopamine, and of noradrenaline. Your brain essentially interprets inflammation as sickness, triggering withdrawal, low energy, anhedonia, and loss of motivation, the exact hallmarks of depression. In fact, some people with treatment-resistant depression can have notably high inflammatory markers, and when you address the inflammation, their mood improves without antidepressants ever entering the picture. But this angle wasn't part of the public health messaging. Depression was framed as a psychological issue, sometimes as a chemical imbalance requiring medication, but rarely as a downstream consequence of systemic inflammation. People were told to see a therapist, to take SSRIs, to practice mindfulness, all potentially helpful interventions, yes, but none of them actually addressing the inflammation driving the symptoms. Brain fog tells a similar story. That frustrating inability to think clearly, remember information, or maintain focus? Well, often it's inflammation. Inflammatory cytokines disrupt the integrity of the blood-brain barrier and impair how neurons communicate. Microglia, which are essentially the brain's immune cells, become overactive and start pruning synapses excessively. What people interpret as laziness or early cognitive decline is frequently neuroinflammation doing damage behind the scenes. And I've seen this play out countless times in the emergency departments that I've worked in. Patients come in with vague symptoms, fatigue, poor concentration, low mood, and every blood test comes back normal because standard panels don't measure inflammation comprehensively. If C-reactive protein gets checked at all, it might be mildly elevated, but not enough to trigger concern. The advice typically boils down to stress management and better sleep. Both genuinely helpful, but neither addressing the root cause of what's actually happening. The metabolic effects are just as significant. Chronic inflammation blocks key metabolic pathways. It impairs insulin signaling, making your cells resistant to glucose uptake. It disrupts leptin, the satiety hormone, creating a state of leptin resistance where your brain can no longer accurately sense your body's fat stores. This drives hunger, even when you have plenty of stored energy. On top of that, inflammation shifts your metabolism towards fat storage and away from fat oxidation, making weight loss incredibly difficult regardless of how carefully you count your calories. And then there's the gut connection, which might be the biggest piece of the puzzle. Your gut lining is only a single cell thick. That's all that stands between your bloodstream and the bacteria and toxins in your digestive tract. When that barrier becomes permeable, a condition we often call leaky gut, bacterial fragments and food particles slip through and trigger immune responses. And given that the gut houses about 70% of your immune system, chronic gut inflammation quickly becomes systemic inflammation that affects every organ in your body. Diet plays a huge role in gut permeability. Ultra-processed foods, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, and high sugar intake all damage the gut lining, while fiber, polyphenols, and fermented foods all support it. But dietary guidelines have historically focused on macronutrients and calories, not gut barrier integrity, so most people had no idea this was even something to pay attention to. Sleep deprivation fuels the fire too. Just one night of poor sleep increases interleukin-6 and CRP levels. Chronic sleep restriction creates a pro-inflammatory state as damaging as smoking. Yet the connection between sleep and inflammation was rarely emphasized in public health advice. Stress follows the same pattern. Chronic psychological stress activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, flooding your system with cortisol. Now, in the short term, cortisol is actually anti-inflammatory. But when it stays elevated chronically, your cortisol receptors lose sensitivity and your whole system becomes dysregulated. Your immune cells lose cortisol's regulatory input and start churning out excessive inflammatory cytokines. Even being sedentary is inflammatory. Physical inactivity allows immune cells to remain in a pro-inflammatory state, while exercise, particularly regular moderate intensity exercise, has powerful anti-inflammatory effects. It stimulates production of interleukin-10, an anti-inflammatory cytokine, and improves overall immune regulation. Yet the advice to move more was always framed around burning calories, not modulating your immune system. Visceral fat adds another layer to the problem. Fat cells, particularly the ones clustered around your abdomen, are metabolically active and inflammatory. They actively secrete inflammatory cytokines, so the more visceral fat you have, the higher your baseline inflammation. And what this does is it creates a vicious cycle. Inflammation drives fat storage, and fat storage increases inflammation. And then there's the omega-3 versus omega-6 balance. Omega-3 fatty acids, particularly EPA and DHA from fish oil, are anti-inflammatory. Omega-6 fatty acids, which are abundant in seed oils and processed foods, become pro-inflammatory when consumed in excess. Now, modern diets have shifted the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio from roughly 1:1 in ancestral diets to 20:1 or higher in typical Western diets. And this is massive. This massive imbalance fuels chronic inflammation, but standard nutritional advice rarely addressed fatty acid ratios in any meaningful way. And we haven't even touched on chronic infections, poor dental health, environmental toxins, or mold exposure, all of which contribute to your overall inflammatory load. Most people never get screened for these issues because the medical system is designed to focus on acute disease, not chronic, low-grade inflammation that silently damages tissue for decades. So here's what it comes down to. People thought they were just tired when they were actually inflamed. They thought they were depressed when they were actually inflamed. They thought they couldn't lose weight because of poor discipline when they were actually inflamed, and the health advice they received never connected these dots. So for decades, mental health guidance treated the mind as if it existed in a vacuum, completely separate from the body. Depression, anxiety, mood disorders, they were framed as psychological problems or chemical imbalances that needed therapy or medication. What rarely made it into mainstream advice was the reality that mental health is profoundly influenced by things like blood sugar, inflammation, gut health, and even how you breathe. Take anxiety, for example. We now know it's often linked to glucose volatility, those rapid swings in blood sugar that create a physiological stress response identical to real danger. Here's what happens. When glucose drops sharply, your body releases adrenaline and cortisol to mobilize stored energy. This triggers exactly the same fight or flight sensations you'd experience in actual danger. Rapid heartbeat, sweating, shaking, racing thoughts. But the problem is that people interpret these symptoms as psychological when they're actually metabolic. Think about someone eating a high-sugar breakfast, skipping lunch, and then relying on multiple coffees to power through the afternoon. They're essentially engineering blood sugar chaos. The anxiety they experience isn't a mental disorder. It's a predictable physiological consequence of how they're fueling their body. Yet, the typical advice was cognitive behavioral therapy, or SSRIs. Now, both can be helpful, absolutely, but neither addresses the glucose instability that's driving the symptoms in the first place. Then there's the gut-brain connection, which we've known about for years, but somehow never made it into mainstream mental health guidance. So your gut produces about 90% of your body's serotonin. Yes, that mood-regulating neurotransmitter everyone associates with antidepressants. Gut bacteria influence neurotransmitter production, inflammation levels, and even vagus nerve signaling to the brain. When your microbiome is imbalanced, what researchers call dysbiosis, you're at higher risk for depression and anxiety. Supporting gut health through probiotics, prebiotics, and fermented foods can genuinely improve your mood. But dietary guidelines barely mention this, and mental health advice almost never did. The idea that eating yogurt or kimchi or sauerkraut could help with depression seemed fringe, despite solid research backing it up. And breathing, something we do unconsciously every moment, turns out to regulate the nervous system more effectively than most psychological interventions. A slow, deep breathing, particularly with extended exhales, activates the parasympathetic nervous system and reduces cortisol. Box breathing, which is 4 seconds in, hold, 4 seconds out, and hold, lowers your heart rate and calms the amygdala. There's even a technique where you can gently hold your breath after a full exhale for 15 to 30 seconds, which triggers a calming response by briefly elevating CO2. This dilates blood vessels and reduces sympathetic nervous system activation. It's more effective for acute stress than affirmations or visualizations, yet it's rarely taught outside specialist breathing programs. Exercise improves mood faster than journaling, not because movement distracts you, but because it literally changes your brain chemistry. Physical activity increases BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports neuron growth and resilience. It boosts endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin. It reduces inflammatory markers and improves blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, which helps with emotional regulation. A 20-minute walk can reduce anxiety as effectively as low-dose benzodiazepines without any of the side effects. Yet, mental health advice often treats exercise as supplementary, something nice to do if you have the time, rather than a first-line intervention. Sleep deprivation doesn't just make you tired, it actively mimics and worsens mental illness. Chronic poor sleep impairs emotional regulation, increases rumination, and makes you perceive threats everywhere. Your amygdala, which is the brain's fear center, becomes hyperactive, while your prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, becomes underactive. And what this does is it creates a state where everything feels overwhelming and manageable problems seem catastrophic. People were told they had anxiety disorders when sometimes they just needed 8 hours of sleep and stable blood sugar. And sunlight matters too. And not just for vitamin D, morning light increases serotonin production and entrains your circadian clock, improving sleep quality. Even on cloudy days, outdoor light is far brighter than indoor lighting and stimulates retinal photoreceptors that influence mood and alertness. We've known for years that seasonal affective disorders respond to light therapy because it works. Yet, general advice for depression rarely emphasizes something as simple as getting outside during daylight hours, particularly in the morning. And then there are the nutritional factors. Magnesium deficiency is surprisingly common and directly affects mental health. It regulates NMDA receptors in the brain, which influence mood and stress responses. Low magnesium is associated with increased anxiety, irritability, and poor sleep. Many people are subclinically deficient due to soil depletion, poor diet, and chronic stress, which actually depletes magnesium even more. Simple supplementation or increasing intake of magnesium-rich foods like leafy greens, nuts, and seeds can improve symptoms, but nutritional psychiatry wasn't part of mainstream mental health guidance. It's the same with omega-3 fatty acids. Multiple studies show that high-dose EPA supplementation improves mood in people with depression, sometimes as effectively as SSRI antidepressant medications. Yet, fish oil was rarely discussed in mental health contexts. The pattern becomes clear. The advice was overwhelmingly psychological. Talk therapy, medication, mindfulness, when many cases had biological roots. Blood sugar instability, inflammation, gut dysbiosis, nutrient deficiency, sleep deprivation, chronic stress without adequate recovery. Addressing these doesn't replace the therapy or the medication when they're genuinely needed, but it removes the physiological barriers that prevent the psychological interventions from working. Because here's the truth. You can't think your way out of hyperglycemia. You can't journal your way out of gut-driven inflammation. One of the most harmful shifts in modern nutrition didn't come from fast food or desserts. It came from what we started drinking. Somewhere between 1970 and today, we quietly stopped eating a large portion of our calories and started drinking them instead. And the metabolic consequences of that shift have been absolutely catastrophic. The perfect example of this is fruit juice, which for decades was marketed as healthy and a normal breakfast staple, something you should be giving your kids every morning. But when you actually look at what happens in the body, the story becomes very different. Think about what happens when you eat an apple. You're getting fiber, you're getting water and fructose all bound together in this cellular matrix, which means it takes time for it to be chewed and digested. The fiber actively slows down sugar absorption, and by the time you're finished eating it, you genuinely feel full and satisfied. Now, contrast that with apple juice, where all of that structural integrity has been completely removed. You get the fructose without any of the fiber, without any of the satiety signals, and without any of the time delay that normally regulates how quickly sugar enters the bloodstream. What you're left with is essentially liquid sugar, and that's exactly how your body processes it. Now, what makes this even more problematic is how the liver handles fructose differently from glucose. Much of it gets converted directly into fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. And when that pathway is activated chronically, day after day, it drives non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It drives insulin resistance, and eventually, it drives full metabolic syndrome. Now, despite all of this, juice was positioned as healthy for decades. It was included in 5-a-day campaigns. Parents gave it to children believing they were providing essential vitamins and minerals. And schools served it alongside lunch. All the while, this one critical fact was quietly overlooked. A glass of orange juice contains roughly the same amount of sugar as a glass of Coke. Smoothies created essentially the same metabolic problem, just packaged in a slightly different form. When you blend fruit, you're breaking down the fiber structure in ways that makes the sugar far more rapidly absorbable than it would be from whole fruit. This makes it incredibly easy to drink 3 bananas, a cup of berries, some mango, and almond milk all in one smoothie, which means you're consuming around 60 grams of sugar in just a few minutes. Compare that to eating the same quantity of whole fruit, which would take you probably an hour to eat, and leave you far more satisfied afterwards. This brings us to the key issue underneath all of this, which is that the problem isn't the fruit itself. The problem is the speed of digestion. Liquid sugar bypasses so many of the mechanical and hormonal signals that normally regulate appetite. When you chew food, that physical action stimulates satiety hormones. When your stomach distends from solid food, stretch receptors activate and signals fullness. When fiber is present, it slows down gastric emptying, giving your body time to register what you've just consumed. But once all of those mechanisms are stripped away, you can consume very large calorie loads without ever really feeling full, which is exactly what makes liquid calories so metabolically dangerous. Coffee culture then laid another major source of liquid calories onto this existing problem. A plain Americano or black coffee contains almost no calories at all, which is fine. But a large caramel latte with oat milk can contain nearly 400 calories, mostly from sugar and added fats. Yet people rarely think that their morning coffee is a meal, even though metabolically that's exactly what it becomes. Oat milk complicated things even further by being marketed aggressively as a healthy dairy alternative when functionally it's essentially just liquid oats. It often spikes blood sugar higher than whole milk does because the processing removes fiber and concentrates carbohydrates. Almond milk, cashew milk, and soy milk can all be fine in moderation, but once they're sweetened and combined with syrups, they simply become another sugar delivery system. The interesting thing is that public health advice never really caught up with this shift. The guidelines talked about limiting sugary drinks, but they didn't meaningfully differentiate between fizzy drinks and fruit juice. The assumption remained that anything derived from fruit must be inherently healthy, even as liquid fructose became one of the largest contributors to daily caloric intake, particularly in children. Energy drinks add yet another concerning layer to this problem. They're marketed aggressively towards teenagers and young adults. They combine high sugar or artificial sweeteners with caffeine and various other stimulant compounds, which creates a blood sugar spike layered on top of an adrenaline-like response. And the result is a brief energy surge followed by a huge crash. And then, with chronic consumption, this pattern fundamentally dysregulates both energy homeostasis and stress hormones. Even protein shakes, which are often promoted as healthy by default, can be problematic for exactly the same reasons. Many pre-made versions contain added sugars, artificial flavorings, and processed oils. And while they're certainly convenient, they also bypass the mechanical act of eating and make overconsumption far more likely. Now, alcohol sits in a category entirely on its own here. It represents liquid calories that actively suppress fat oxidation because the body prioritizes metabolizing alcohol over almost everything else since it's technically a toxin. While your liver is processing alcohol, fat burning essentially stops, which is why even moderate alcohol consumption can impair body composition goals and long-term metabolic health despite otherwise solid habits. The deeper hidden issue beneath all of this is that liquid calories simply don't register in the brain satiety centers in the same way that solid food does. You can drink 500 calories and feel just as hungry an hour later as if you consumed nothing at all, because the ghrelin-leptin signaling that normally regulates appetite doesn't respond to liquids in the same way it responds to solid food. This is how people ended up unknowingly consuming hundreds and sometimes thousands of extra calories each week without ever feeling truly satisfied, and then being blamed for overeating and told to simply eat less. Now, the solution here isn't eliminating everything except water, which would be neither realistic nor necessary. It's understanding that drinks should be treated as food. If you're drinking calories, you need to account for them in the same way you would account for a meal. This means prioritizing whole fruits over juice, choosing black coffee or unsweetened tea over sugary lattes, and recognizing that a smoothie is actually a meal rather than a beverage. That nuance, however, never really made it into public health messaging. The advice stayed generic: avoid fizzy drinks and drink more water, with very little said about juice, lattes, smoothies, or the fundamental metabolic difference between eating and drinking your calories. Okay, now let's talk about hydration, because drink more water is one of the most common pieces of health advice in the world. It's simple, it's universal, and it's mostly correct, except for one critical detail that almost never gets mentioned. Water on its own, without the minerals that should accompany it, can actually push your body into a state of imbalance. Hydration isn't just about how much fluid you take in, it's fundamentally about electrolyte concentration. Sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, these minerals regulate nerve signaling. They regulate muscle contraction, blood pressure, and basic cellular function. And water constantly dilutes or concentrates these electrolytes depending on how much you drink and how much you lose through sweat, urine, and respiration. When people drink very large amounts of plain water without replacing the electrolytes, they can develop something called hyponatremia, which is dangerously low sodium levels. The symptoms are often quite subtle at first, things like headache, confusion, fatigue, nausea, and then in more severe cases, you can see seizures or even a coma. This happens far more often than people realize, particularly in endurance athletes who overhydrate during events or people who drink excessive water while fasting or restricting food. The body maintains a very precise sodium-potassium balance across your cell membranes, and that balance creates the electrical gradients that literally power nerve impulses, that power muscle contractions and heart rhythm. When electrolytes become depleted, people feel weak, they feel foggy, lightheaded, and often get heart palpitations. The natural interpretation is that they're dehydrated, so they drink more water, which can actually worsen the imbalance rather than fix it. Now, sodium in particular has been demonized for decades. High sodium diets were linked to hypertension, so the public messaging became reduce salt, which made perfect sense for people eating ultra-processed foods loaded with hidden sodium. But this guidance quietly created a different problem for people who eat mostly whole foods, who exercise regularly, or who live in hot climates where sodium loss through sweat is quite significant. If you're active, if you sweat heavily, or if you eat very little processed food, you often need more sodium than the current guidelines suggest. Muscle cramps, dizziness when standing up, headaches, and chronic fatigue can all be signs of sodium deficiency rather than excess. But most people never even consider that possibility. Now, potassium sits on the other side of that balance, regulating fluid movement and blood pressure in opposition to sodium, and most people consume far too little of it. Potassium-rich foods like leafy greens, avocados, potatoes, and bananas should be everyday staples, yet the public conversation focused almost entirely on restricting sodium without emphasizing the critical importance of adequate potassium intake at all. Magnesium deficiency is even more widespread and deeply under-recognized. Magnesium is involved in over 300 enzymatic reactions in the body, including energy production, muscle relaxation, and neurotransmitter synthesis. So when magnesium levels are low, people experience muscle cramps, anxiety, poor sleep, again, heart palpitations, and even constipation, symptoms that are often treated in isolation rather than tracked back to the underlying mineral depletion. Modern soil is also depleted of magnesium due to industrial farming practices, which means that even people who eat what they consider healthy may not be getting adequate amounts from food alone. Chronic stress burns through magnesium, caffeine depletes magnesium, alcohol depletes magnesium. Yet blood tests for magnesium are rarely ordered by doctors, and when they are, they usually measure serum magnesium, which doesn't really reflect what's actually happening inside the cells where magnesium does its functional work. For people who genuinely are deficient of magnesium, then supplements can dramatically improve your energy, your mood, and your sleep quality. Yet this was never integrated into any meaningful health advice. For decades, hydration was treated like simple plumbing. More water in, more water out. But the reality is that this is a bioelectrical system. Every cell in your body depends on specific ionic concentrations to function properly. The nervous system runs on sodium and potassium gradients. Muscle contraction depends on calcium and magnesium. When those symptoms are ignored and the focus stays solely on water intake, you're missing half of the picture. Electrolyte imbalance also directly affects cognitive performance. Brain cells communicate through electrical signals driven by ion movement, and when electrolytes are off, neural communication slows down. Concentration drops, reaction times lag, memory suffers, and people assume they're just mentally foggy when they're actually electrolyte depleted. In medical settings, this is actually really well understood. Oral rehydration solutions used to treat dehydration contain precise ratios of sodium, potassium, and glucose because glucose actively helps sodium and water absorb more efficiently into the body through a co-transport mechanism. Yet those same principles were rarely applied to everyday hydration, to illness recovery, or exercise contexts. Sports drinks stepped into that gap, but most of them contain excessive sugar and artificial ingredients. Electrolyte powders and tablets now offer much cleaner options, but again, this was never incorporated into standard public advice. Caffeine and alcohol complicate this even further because both of them act as diuretics, increasing urine output and mineral loss. If you drink coffee or alcohol regularly, you don't just need more water to compensate, you need more electrolytes as well. The old advice to drink more water after alcohol was directionally correct, but incomplete without mentioning electrolyte replacement alongside it. Many symptoms like afternoon fatigue, headaches, brain fog, irritability, and poor exercise performance are routinely blamed on dehydration when the real issue is actually electrolyte imbalance. People drink more water, they feel slightly better for a moment, and then they crash again because the underlying mineral deficiency was never addressed. The solution itself is actually very simple and straightforward. Consume adequate sodium, potassium, and magnesium through food or supplements. Add a pinch of high-quality salt to your water. Eat potassium-rich vegetables regularly. Consider magnesium supplements if deficiency is likely based on your lifestyle and symptoms. But instead, the public message stayed stuck on drink 8 glasses of water a day as if water alone was sufficient for cellular health and optimal function. Okay, now let's move on to stress, because reduced stress is advice that everyone has heard, very few people can actually follow, and most don't fully understand what it means in biological terms. Here's what's important to grasp. Stress itself isn't inherently bad. In fact, acute stress is healthy, it's adaptive, and absolutely essential for performance. It sharpens your focus, it temporarily boosts your immune function, and mobilizes energy so you can respond effectively to challenges. The real problem isn't the presence of stress in your life, it's the complete absence of recovery afterwards. Your stress response, which is controlled primarily by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is designed to operate in short, sharp bursts. A threat appears, your cortisol and adrenaline spike, your heart rate rises, blood flow is then redirected to your muscles and the brain. You respond to the challenge, and then the system is meant to return to baseline. That pattern of stress followed by recovery is actually what builds resilience over time. Modern life quietly broke that rhythm in ways that most people don't fully appreciate. Chronic work pressure, financial anxiety, relationship conflict, sleep deprivation, and constant digital stimulation all combine to create a state where the stress response never fully switches off. Cortisol stays elevated, the nervous system remains stuck in fight or flight mode, and genuine physiological recovery never really happens. When cortisol stays high for extended periods, the consequences become widespread and really problematic. Immune function becomes impaired, making you more susceptible to illness. Sleep becomes fragmented, preventing proper restoration. Visceral fat storage, that increases as well, particularly around the abdomen. Insulin sensitivity falls, pushing you towards metabolic dysfunction. Chronically elevated cortisol actually shrinks the hippocampus, which is the brain region responsible for memory and emotional regulation. And it disrupts your prefrontal cortex function, reducing your capacity for decision-making and impulse control. Yet the advice to simply reduce stress assumes that you can somehow eliminate stressors from your life, which for most people isn't realistic or even possible. Work demands don't just disappear because you want them to. Financial pressures remain. Family responsibilities continue. The real solution isn't trying to eliminate stress from your life, which is futile. It's building your body's capacity to recover from stress efficiently, which is entirely within your control. Recovery is a physiological process. not just a psychological one. It requires activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest branch that counterbalances fight or flight. This doesn't happen through positive thinking alone. It happens through specific biological inputs: slow breathing, cold exposure, heat exposure, gentle movement, social connection, and sleep. Contrast therapy, which involves alternating between cold and heat, creates a powerful hormone reset. Cold exposure triggers noradrenaline release, sharpening your focus and lifting your mood. Heat exposure, on the other hand, through saunas or hot baths, stimulates heat shock proteins that support cellular repair. Alternating between the two trains your nervous system to move smoothly between activation and relaxation, rather than getting stuck at one extreme. For many people, brief cold exposure after intense stress lowers your cortisol and improves your mood more reliably than meditation alone. Which doesn't mean meditation is useless. It's genuinely valuable, but it's not the only tool, and it doesn't work equally well for everybody. Now, movement after stress is just as critical to understand. The stress response mobilizes energy in the form of glycogen and fatty acids in anticipation of physical action. When stress is purely psychological, like sitting at a desk worrying about deadlines, that energy never gets used. A 10-minute walk or a short workout clears stress hormones and restores baseline far faster than sitting still and trying to relax through willpower alone. Social connection might actually be one of the most powerful and underappreciated stress buffers we have access to. Oxytocin, which is released during positive social interaction, directly counteract cortisol at the receptor level. Time spent with trusted friends or family lowers inflammatory markers and improves emotional resilience. Yet stress advice rarely places any meaningful emphasis on the protective role of relationships. Sleep, meanwhile, is completely non-negotiable for stress recovery. During deep sleep, cortisol is cleared from the system and neurotransmitter balance is restored. Chronic sleep deprivation blocks that recovery process entirely, creating this vicious cycle where stress disrupts sleep and poor sleep amplifies stress sensitivity the following day. What's often missed in these discussions is that nervous system regulation can actually be trained over time. Heart rate variability, which is the variation in time between heartbeats, is actually one of the clearest markers of nervous system flexibility. High HRV reflects the ability to shift efficiently between stress and recovery states. A low HRV reflects a rigid, chronically activated system that struggles to downregulate. Now, practices that improve HRV, things like breath work, movement, sleep, and deliberate recovery protocols, don't just feel subjectively calming. They create measurable physiological changes in how your nervous system functions. Yet, HRV was historically discussed almost exclusively in elite athletic settings, not as a foundational pillar of everyday health that everybody should be understanding. The modern stress epidemic isn't really about having too many deadlines or too much to do. It's about having too little recovery. It's about nervous systems trapped in activation mode with no reliable off switch, compounded by sleep deprivation, inflammatory diets, sedentary lifestyles, and social isolation. The standard advice frames stress management as a purely personal responsibility. Things like meditate more, take breaks, practice mindfulness, all of which, yes, they are useful, but none of which are sufficient without addressing the underlying biological machinery of recovery itself. Stress isn't the enemy here. Chaos is. Unrelenting activation without rest, constant stimulation without stillness, pressure without recovery. The solution isn't eliminating stress from your life, which again is impossible for most people. It's creating daily rhythms that allow your biology to restore itself on a consistent basis. Now, I want to share something that most people don't realize about the medical system itself. And this is important context for understanding why health advice has been so inadequate. So doctors receive almost no training in nutrition, in metabolism, or lifestyle medicine during medical school. I've been through over 15 years, I think, of medical training so far. And across all of that, I received maybe 2 weeks of formal nutrition education, of proper nutrition education, 2 weeks total to cover one of the most important determinants of chronic disease. Medical education is fundamentally built around pathology and treatment. You learn to diagnose disease and prescribe interventions, medications, procedures, and surgeries. It's an inherently reactive model. Someone gets sick, you treat them. Prevention, particularly lifestyle prevention, barely appears in the curriculum in any meaningful way these days. Biochemistry and physiology are taught in the first 2 years, often in exhaustive detail. You learn the Krebs cycle, you learn about insulin pathways, you learn about lipid metabolism at the cellular level, but it's theoretical. It's completely disconnected from practical application. Nobody teaches you how to help an actual patient optimize their metabolism through diet, exercise, and sleep in ways they can sustain. When nutrition does come up in training, it's usually in the context of disease management, diabetic diets, renal diets, low sodium protocols for hypertension. You learn what to restrict in order to prevent immediate harm, not how to build health from the ground up. The focus is damage control, not optimization. Lifestyle medicine, which is the clinical application of evidence-based lifestyle interventions to prevent and treat disease, is still classified as alternative in many institutions. Despite the overwhelming evidence that diet, exercise, sleep, and stress management outperform drugs for many chronic conditions, these approaches remain marginalized in mainstream medical training. The result is a healthcare system that's staffed by highly trained doctors who know how to treat acute illness exceptionally, but they have little formal expertise in preventing chronic disease in the first place. Emergency medicine trained me to manage heart attacks, strokes, sepsis, major trauma. I became exceptionally good at crisis intervention, but nobody taught me how to prevent those crises from happening in the first place, which is where the vast majority of health outcomes are actually determined. Consultations are structured around the 10-minute appointment model, which works fine for acute problems, antibiotics for an infection, stitches for a laceration, imaging for a suspected fracture, but it's completely inadequate for addressing lifestyle-related chronic disease, which requires time, it requires nuance and ongoing support. You can't teach somebody how to restructure their diet, build an exercise habit, improve sleep, and manage stress effectively in 10 minutes. Even if a doctor had the training to do so, which most genuinely don't, the system doesn't allow the time. So instead, patients get prescriptions. They get statins for cholesterol, they get metformin for blood sugar, they get antihypertensives for their blood pressure. These medications work in the sense that they reduce the immediate risk, but they don't address the root causes at all. And for many patients, lifestyle intervention would be as effective or more effective without any of the side effects. There's also a significant economic misalignment at play here. Pharmaceutical companies fund continuing medical education. They sponsor conferences and they provide research funding. There's no equivalent financial incentive structure for promoting whole foods, resistance training, or sleep hygiene. Nobody profits from recommending push-ups and vegetables, which means those interventions don't get the same institutional support. Medical guidelines are written by committees, often influenced by industry funding. Food companies sponsor nutrition research. Pharmaceutical companies sponsor treatment guidelines. The result is guidance that systematically favors profitable interventions over low-cost lifestyle changes that might actually be more effective. Public health campaigns suffer the same fundamental gap. They're designed and approved by people with medical degrees who themselves weren't trained in practical behavior change, in metabolic optimization or nutrition science beyond the basics. So the messaging ends up being oversimplified slogans that sound good, but don't actually work in practice. Doctors graduate medical school believing that health is primarily managed through drugs and procedures because that's what the training emphasizes overwhelmingly. Many people genuinely don't know that resistance training improves your insulin sensitivity as effectively as metformin, or that eliminating ultra-processed foods can reverse fatty liver disease, or that a sleep extension reduces cardiovascular risk as much as some medications do. This isn't malice or deliberate negligence, it's institutional structure. Medical schools teach what regulators mandate, what accreditation boards require, and what the medical establishment considers standard practice. And for the last 50 years, that standard practice has been receive treatment, not proactive prevention. I had to seek out lifestyle medicine on my own. It wasn't part of the core curriculum at all. It was an elective add-on, something that you pursued if you were personally interested, not something that every doctor learns as a foundational knowledge. The consequence of all of this is a population receiving health advice from doctors who weren't actually taught how to give it properly. And when the advice inevitably fails, as it so often does, both doctors and patients are left thinking that the problem was that the patients didn't follow the advice properly. Okay, let's talk about ultra-processed foods, because this topic goes far beyond simple weight gain. These foods don't just make people gain weight, they fundamentally change your brain chemistry, they disrupt your gut health, and they alter metabolic signaling in ways that have very little to do with simple calorie balance. Ultra-processed foods are engineered specifically for overconsumption. Food scientists deliberately optimize flavor, texture, and mouthfeel to trigger the strongest possible reward response in your brain with the weakest possible satiety signal afterwards. The blend of refined carbohydrates, of industrial seed oils, of salt, sugar, and synthetic flavorings creates a sensory experience that bypasses the body's normal appetite regulation entirely. You don't just eat these foods, your nervous system gets pulled into over-consuming them almost compulsively. What makes this even more metabolically destabilizing is the combination of high reward with very low nutrient density. The brain expects nutrients to accompany calories based on evolutionary programming. When you eat real food, nutrient centers in the gut signal satisfaction and completion. But with ultra-processed food, you get energy without the micronutrients that usually come packaged with it. The brain keeps driving hunger, still searching for vitamins and minerals, even though you've already consumed plenty of calories. This is why you can eat an entire bag of crisps and still feel oddly unsatisfied afterward, yet a meal of steak and veg can leave you full for hours with similar or even fewer total calories. For appetite regulation, nutrient density matters far more than calorie density alone. Artificial flavoring adds another problematic layer to all of this by hijacking the dopamine system in concerning ways. A real strawberry, for example, contains hundreds of volatile flavor compounds that create this complex taste profile. Artificial strawberry flavor has maybe a handful of chemicals designed to imitate the dominant notes. Your taste buds register strawberry, dopamine is released in anticipation of nutrition, but the nutritional payload never actually arrives. The brain receives expectation without fulfillment, and that mismatch creates a drive to keep eating in search of satisfaction. The loop becomes compulsive rather than regulated. Food stops being primarily fuel and increasingly becomes stimulation, entertainment in an otherwise understimulating environment. This is one of the key reasons ultra-processed foods behave so differently from anything humans evolved eating over hundreds of thousands of years. The speed at which these foods can be consumed compounds the metabolic effect significantly. Ultra-processed foods are soft, they require minimal chewing and dissolve rapidly in the mouth. You can consume them faster than your satiety hormones can register fullness and send appropriate signals. By the time leptin finally signals that you've had enough, you've often already overeaten by several hundred calories. Eating speed also affects serotonin production. Serotonin, which is often labeled as a mood neurotransmitter, is partly regulated through gut activity during digestion. Slow eating through chewing and prolonged contact between food and the gut lining support healthy serotonin production. Rapid eating disrupts this entire process. This is why people can feel emotionally flat or irritable after eating fast food, even if they're physically full. The serotonin response is blunted because the food moved through your gut too quickly. Ultra-processed foods also damage the gut lining itself through multiple different mechanisms. Emulsifiers, which are added to blend ingredients that don't normally mix, degrade the mucus layer that protects the intestinal wall. This increases gut permeability, allowing bacterial fragments and endotoxins to enter the bloodstream and trigger systemic inflammation. Artificial sweeteners further disrupt your gut bacteria in other problematic ways. Studies show that saccharin, sucralose, and aspartame alter the gut microbiome composition in ways that impair glucose tolerance. Diet drinks, which were marketed originally as healthy alternatives to regular Coke or lemonade or whatever, can paradoxically worsen metabolic health by disrupting your microbial function even without providing calories. Then there are the processed seed oils, things like soybean, corn, and canola, which are high in omega-6 fatty acids and promote inflammation when consumed in excess relative to omega-3s. These oils are chemically extracted, even oxidized during processing, and structurally very different from the fats found in whole foods throughout human history. They're cheap, they are shelf-stable, and they're now present in almost everything. The food industry replaced animal fats and tropical oils with seed oils following the low-fat dietary guidelines of the 1970s, assuming plant oils were automatically healthier. But then, decades later, rates of metabolic disease rose sharply despite significant reductions in saturated fat intake, suggesting that the metabolic story was far more complex than the guidelines implied. Ultra-processed foods also contain dozens of additives whose long-term effects were never truly studied over decades of daily exposure. Preservatives, colorings, and texture modifiers that pass short-term safety testing, they were never evaluated for lifelong cumulative impact on the human body. Children exposed to ultra-processed foods from infancy develop taste preferences that favor hyperpalatable, nutrient-poor foods. Their dopamine systems become calibrated to artificial stimulation, and whole foods begin to feel bland by comparison. And what this does is, it creates a generational loop where food becomes increasingly engineered. Palates adapt downwards away from real food, and each generation becomes more metabolically disconnected from what humans actually evolved to eat. The solution isn't demonizing all processed food, which would be neither realistic or necessary. Some processing is genuinely helpful, and it makes food more accessible and even cheaper. Things like frozen veg, canned beans, whole grain bread. The real issue is ultra-processing. Foods with ingredient lists you wouldn't recognize and forms that no longer resemble anything that grows in nature. The thing is, you don't need complex nutrition science to choose better food. A few simple rules can guide you most of the time. Eat foods with fewer than 5 ingredients. Eat foods your great-grandmother would have recognized as food. Eat foods that eventually will rot if they're left out. These filters remove most ultra-processed products almost automatically without requiring detailed nutritional knowledge. But public health advice focused on isolated nutrients instead. Low fat, low sodium, whole grains, without addressing food processing itself or the fundamental metabolic difference between engineered products and real food. Right then, so let's talk about exercise, because the standard advice here was similarly incomplete in critical ways. Move more, get 10,000 steps, cardio for heart health. All of these messages dominated exercise guidance for decades. And while movement is undeniably beneficial, the advice missed several essential components. Walking is genuinely good for you. It improves cardiovascular health, it supports mental well-being, and it increases daily energy expenditure. But walking alone doesn't build muscle. It doesn't significantly improve your VO2 max. It doesn't create the metabolic adaptations necessary for long-term health optimization. Zone 2 cardio, which is moderate intensity exercise where you can still hold a conversation, but you're working hard enough to elevate your heart rate significantly, preserves something called metabolic flexibility. Now, metabolic flexibility is the ability to switch efficiently between burning carbs and fats for fuel, depending on what's available. As people age or become sedentary, they lose this flexibility. The body becomes overly reliant on glucose and struggles to access fat stores for energy efficiently. Zone 2 training, which is typically 30 to 60 minutes at around 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, restores fat oxidation capacity and improves mitochondrial function at the cellular level. This was rarely mentioned in public health campaigns. The advice was generic, which was get your heart rate up without specifying intensity, without specifying duration or the specific physiological purpose. VO2 max, which is the maximum amount of oxygen your body can use during exercise, is one of the strongest predictors of lifespan that we know of. Higher VO2 max correlates with lower all-cause mortality, better cognitive function as you age, and reduced chronic disease risk across the board. And VO2 max naturally declines with age unless actively maintained through appropriate training. High-intensity interval training, or HIIT, which is short bursts of maximum effort followed by recovery periods, is the most effective way to improve it. Yet HIIT was often presented as optional, something for athletes or fitness enthusiasts, not as a foundational element of health that everybody should incorporate. Resistance training was mentioned in the guidelines, yes, but it was never fully emphasized with the urgency it really deserves. The advice was typically strength train twice a week, buried under cardio recommendations, as if muscle mass was a secondary concern. But muscle is metabolically active tissue. It regulates blood sugar by providing glucose disposal capacity. It supports bone density, preventing osteoporosis. It prevents falls and maintains independence as you age. Resistance training is not optional for healthy aging. It's absolutely essential, yet it was treated as supplementary rather than foundational. Movement also improves your immune surveillance in ways that were never really part of mainstream exercise messaging. Exercise increases circulation, which helps immune cells patrol tissues more effectively and respond to threats faster. Moderate exercise reduces systemic inflammation and lowers the risk of infections. Chronic inactivity impairs your immune function, making people more susceptible to illness. The immune benefit was almost never discussed. The focus stayed on weight loss and heart health, with vague mentions of feeling better without explaining the biological mechanisms. Exercise also profoundly improves brain health through multiple different pathways. It increases something called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, supporting neuroplasticity and the growth of new neurons. It improves blood flow to the brain, delivering oxygen and nutrients more efficiently. It reduces neuroinflammation, which is a key driver of cognitive decline. Aerobic exercise enhances memory consolidation. Resistance training improves executive function. Coordination exercises, things like dancing or martial arts, build new neural connections. People were told exercise helps with weight management when it does so much more than that. It's cognitive therapy, it's metabolic regulation, it's immune support, it's mental health treatment delivered through movement. The calorie burn focus also created a transactional mindset that missed the point entirely. Exercise to burn calories, eat less to lose weight. This misses the deeper biological purpose of movement. Exercise creates hormonal signaling that improves insulin sensitivity, muscle protein synthesis, mitochondrial biogenesis, and cellular repair mechanisms. You can't out-exercise a bad diet. That's absolutely true, but you also can't diet your way to metabolic health without movement. They work synergistically, not independently. The guidelines also lacked actionable specificity. Be active doesn't tell someone what to actually do in practice. Compare that to something like lift weights 3 times per week, focusing on compound movements like squats, deadlifts, and rows. Do 30 minutes of zone 2 cardio twice per week. Add 1 high-intensity session weekly to maintain VO2 max. Now that's actionable and specific. Move more simply isn't. Recovery was ignored entirely in public health messaging as well. Exercise is a stress that breaks down tissue. Adaptation and improvement happen during recovery, not during the workout itself. Overtraining, exercising too frequently without adequate rest, impairs progress, it increases your injury risk, and dysregulates hormones including cortisol and testosterone. Rest days aren't laziness or lack of commitment. They're when your body rebuilds stronger than before. And exercise advice also failed to account for individual variation in recovery capacity. Someone who's been sedentary for years can't jump straight into intense training without significant injury risk. Programming should scale appropriately to current capacity, starting small and building progressively over time. The message should have been clear and comprehensive. Move in ways that build strength, preserve cardiovascular capacity, and support metabolic flexibility. But instead, it was step counts and generic cardio recommendations. One of the most damaging assumptions embedded into health advice is that everyone responds the same way to the same inputs. Eat this, do that, everyone gets the same result. But human biology doesn't work that way at all. Metabolic individuality, the idea that genetic variation, the idea that gut microbiome composition, that stress load, sleep quality, and activity levels create vastly different responses to identical interventions, is fundamentally reshaping how we think about health optimization moving forward. Post-meal glucose responses vary dramatically between individuals in ways that completely contradict the one-size-fits-all dietary advice. One person eats white rice and their blood sugar barely moves from baseline. Another person eats the same portion and spikes to pre-diabetic levels. This isn't about willpower or discipline, it's pure physiology. Continuous glucose monitors have revealed just how personalized metabolism actually is. Foods traditionally labeled as healthy can cause problematic glucose responses in some people, while foods considered unhealthy might be metabolically neutral for others based on their individual biology. Gut microbiome composition explains a significant part of this variation. Different bacterial populations extract different amounts of energy from the same foods and produce different metabolites that influence insulin sensitivity, inflammation, and nutrient absorption. Someone with a microbiome rich in fiber-fermenting bacteria handles complex carbohydrates efficiently and extracts beneficial short-chain fatty acids. Someone with dysbiosis struggles with the same foods and may experience bloating, inflammation, and poor blood sugar control. Generic dietary advice completely ignores this layer of individual variation. Genetic variation affects nutrient metabolism in other profound ways as well. Some people have gene variants that impair vitamin D absorption from sunlight. Others can't efficiently convert plant-based omega-3s into the longer chain forms the brain needs. Caffeine metabolism varies dramatically as well. One person thrives on coffee and experiences improved focus, while another person becomes anxious and jittery from the exact same dose due to different enzyme activity. Lactose tolerance varies by ancestry as well. Northern Europeans typically retain lactase production into their adulthood years, whereas most East Asians simply don't. So telling everybody to drink milk ignores the fundamental genetic diversity across populations. The stress capacity differs significantly between individuals based on genetics, early life experiences, and the current circumstances of that person. Some people have robust stress response systems that recover quickly from challenges. Other people have more sensitive nervous systems that require more recovery time between stresses. The same workload that one person handles easily might dysregulate another person's cortisol pattern and sleep architecture. Exercise response also varies considerably. Some people are just high responders to aerobic training, quickly improving their VO2 max with relatively modest training volumes. But then others are low responders, requiring significantly more volume and intensity to see meaningful gains. Muscle building capacity varies based on genetics, on hormone levels, age, and training history. Recovery needs differ substantially across individuals. A 25-year-old athlete recovers from intense training much faster than a 55-year-old desk worker due to differences in hormone profiles, in mitochondrial function, and accumulated stress load. Sleep needs, nutrient requirements, and injury risk aren't uniform across ages, sexes, or activity levels. So the one-size-fits-all model of health advice, eat less fat, move more, sleep 8 hours, was never going to work for everyone because everyone isn't starting from the same baseline or responding to interventions in the same way. The next wave of health optimization will be adaptive and personalized, not prescriptive and generic. Wearable technology, like continuous glucose monitors, sleep trackers, heart rate variability monitors, all of these provide real-time data about individual responses to your specific interventions. You can test how your body actually reacts to specific foods, exercise intensities, sleep patterns, and adjust accordingly based on objective data rather than generic recommendations. This doesn't mean abandoning general principles entirely, because some truths are universal. Resistance training builds muscle in everyone. Sleep supports recovery in everyone. Ultra-processed foods cause metabolic dysfunction in everyone. But the details, things like meal timing, macronutrient ratios, exercise volume, stress management techniques, Those genuinely do need personalization based on individual biology and lifestyle context. Nutritional biochemistry is advancing rapidly. We're learning how specific genetic variants affect methylation pathways, detoxification capacity, inflammatory responses, and hormone metabolism. And eventually, dietary recommendations might be tailored based on comprehensive analysis of genetic profiles, of microbiome composition, and metabolic biomarkers. The danger, of course, is overcomplication. Some people need simple, consistent habits that they can sustain long term, not endless biohacking and optimization protocols. The goal isn't to optimize every possible variable, it's to find sustainable patterns that work for your specific biology, for your lifestyle, and your goals without becoming obsessive. Generic advice will always have an important place in public health. It establishes useful baselines and provides accessible entry points. But the future is precision. Understanding that what works exceptionally well for one person might not work well at all for another. And that's not failure on anyone's part, it's simply biology. People didn't fail the advice failed the people by assuming biological uniformity that doesn't exist. Now, if you've ever followed health advice perfectly and you still didn't get the results you were promised, this final section is specifically for you. You tracked your calories meticulously, you joined the gym, and you showed up consistently. You bought all of the low-fat foods, you walked your 10,000 steps every single day. You did everything you were told to do by doctors, by nutritionists, and health authorities, and it didn't work. Or maybe it worked briefly, and then it stopped. Or you lost weight initially, and then gained it all back. Or you actually felt worse despite doing everything right. And at some point, you probably blamed yourself for the failure. You assumed you lacked discipline, you lacked willpower or commitment. You internalized the failure as a personal character flaw. But the truth is actually simpler and far less flattering to the system that provided you with the advice. A wrong map leads to the wrong destination, no matter how hard you try or how committed you are to the journey. You can have perfect navigation skills, you can have unwavering determination and absolutely flawless execution, but if the map says north when you actually need to go south, then you'll never arrive at your intended destination. For 50 years, public health guidance provided a map based on incomplete science, oversimplified messaging, and institutional biases. It told you to count calories without explaining the role of hormones in metabolism. It emphasized macronutrient ratios without mentioning meal timing or food quality. It recommended movement without specifying intensity, without specifying the type of exercise or recovery needs. It suggested getting more sleep without addressing circadian rhythm or sleep architecture. And when you followed that map faithfully and still didn't reach your destination, you were told the problem was you. Your lack of discipline, your poor choices, your inability to commit. But here's what you need to understand. Bodies are not misbehaving. They are following orders, biological orders, shaped by millions of years of evolution, refined by hormonal signaling, and regulated by ancient neural circuits. Your body is doing exactly what it's designed to do in response to the inputs it receives. If you eat foods that spike blood sugar repeatedly, your body stores excess energy as fat. That's not failure on your part. That's insulin doing its job in response to the signal you provided. If you restrict calories without adequate protein intake, your body breaks down muscle tissue to meet amino acid needs. That's not weakness, that's survival physiology protecting critical functions. And then if you sleep poorly on a chronic basis, your body elevates hunger hormones to drive energy intake. That's not lack of willpower, that's ghrelin and leptin responding appropriately to sleep deprivation. If you're chronically stressed without adequate recovery, your body stores visceral fat to prepare for prolonged resource scarcity. That's not laziness, that's cortisol following its evolutionary programming. Your body isn't broken, it's the advice that was broken. The guidance was always incomplete, oversimplified, and often contradictory. The good news in all of this is that once you have the right map, the actual biology, the real physiology, the actual mechanisms that genuinely govern health, the path forward becomes significantly clearer. A new map must integrate biology, psychology, physics, and rhythm into a coherent network. Biology, understanding hormones, inflammation, gut health, and muscle mass. Psychology, recognizing that willpower is a finite resource, that habits are remarkably powerful, and environment fundamentally shapes behavior. Physics, acknowledging that energy balance matters, but within the context of metabolic flexibility and nutrient density. Rhythm, respecting circadian biology, respecting meal timing, stress recovery cycles, and sleep architecture. At the end of the day, this isn't about achieving perfection, which is neither necessary or sustainable. It's about building daily systems that align with how your body actually works at a fundamental level. Start with just one change, not 10 simultaneous interventions. Just one. Eat protein at breakfast. Walk after meals. Go to bed at the same time every night. Lift weights twice a week. Cut out liquid sugar. Just one change, just one of those things, sustained consistently over time, creates momentum. It improves one biomarker, which improves another, which changes how you feel subjectively, which then motivates the next change in a positive feedback loop. Health optimization isn't a sprint. It's not even a marathon. It's a direction. And every small step in the right direction compounds over time through mechanisms we're only beginning to fully understand. Now, hope lies in rebuilding daily systems, not chasing motivation. Motivation is an emotion that fades when circumstances become difficult. Systems persist regardless of emotional states. You don't need to be inspired and motivated every single day. You need habits that function automatically regardless of how you feel in that moment. You don't need perfect discipline. You need an environment that makes healthy choices easier than unhealthy ones through thoughtful design. You don't need to eliminate all stress from your life. You need recovery rhythms built into your routine that restore resilience on a consistent basis. The health advice over the last 50 years failed millions of people. It created shame, confusion, and metabolic dysfunction on a scale we're only beginning to understand and quantify. But that era is now ending. We have the tools. We have wearable technology, microbiome testing. We have continuous glucose monitoring, genetic analysis, all of this to understand individual biology in ways previous generations simply couldn't access. We have the science, we have lifestyle medicine, we have metabolic research, chronobiology, to build health systems that actually work when implemented properly. And we have the communication platforms to bypass institutional inertia and share accurate, actionable information directly with people who need it. The future of health isn't more willpower or harder restriction. It's better systems built on accurate understanding. It's not deprivation and suffering, it's intelligent optimization. It's not shame and blame, it's understanding and compassion. And it starts with rejecting the idea that you failed. You didn't fail the advice failed you. So now it's time to build something better based on what we actually know about human biology.